Thank you for joining us this morning. I just want to say that by way of very quick introduction, that we are looking at two very specific programs. We're actually looking at three. The first one is a QUEST program, which is a 5-year accelerated BA MAT program where our students have a major in a particular content area and then go on. They begin their undergraduate education courses in their first 2 years, and then they begin graduate studies in their junior year, and they do student teaching 2 semesters in their 5th year. And Kate Spence is the director of that program. And then we have a traditional MAT program for candidates who have a degree from some other institution prior to coming to us. Sometimes it's Fairleigh, sometimes it's another institution. And they go through a program for teacher preparation with their core courses, their field experiences, and moving on to student teaching. And we also have an alternate route program, and all of these are requiring, obviously, the field work, the two-part student teaching, except for alternate route, and the edTPA. Okay, go ahead, Kate. All right, so we just want to take a quick look at the timelines that we're dealing with, and then we want to speak about a little bit about what we've been doing and how we've been supporting our students. And I will say to start out with that all of our moves were what I would call preemptive. Once we heard that this was coming down, whatever this was coming down the pike, we put into play some plan to address what the state DOE was going to be sending us. So the first part was the timeline of the 2 semesters of student teaching, and we immediately started in with a 2-semester plan for that. And what we're looking at is that plan. We're looking at how we're preparing our candidates when we have multiple professors who have I'll call it custody of the same courses, how we're looking for continuity, and what happens when student teaching turns remote. So those were the issues we're looking at. So the adoption of the edTPA started in 2016. We knew it was coming. It was optional for all I'm sorry. Somebody said something? Okay. It was optional for our students to work on the edTPA, and we made it mandatory, but obviously not counting towards their grade or their graduation at that point in time. We wanted to run a pilot to get a baseline to see where things were holding. In 2017, edTPA became required for certification, but students did not have to yet meet a cut score. And again, we were looking for baseline data. Then in 2018, the candidates had to meet the cut score, and they had to submit their edTPA for formal scoring. And at that point, we had some really interesting data that we were looking at, and we are still looking at it. And then, of course, the next year, the pandemic hit. So now we have in 2019 and 20, the state had standard setting. A cut score was set 1 standard error of measurement below the national recommendations. And when COVID hit in the spring, edTPA took on a whole new meaning, and there were flexibilities put in place. We still collected data, and we at Fairleigh still required our students to do submission of the edTPA. In 2020-21, which is our current year, we're still addressing those COVID-19 issues. There are flexibilities, but not waivers in place. There's possibility for local scoring, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And there is new standard setting underway by the DOE. Then we'll look at the timeline of the 2-semester student teaching. So in spring 2018, we ran our first pilot of what we call advanced clinical practice. That's clinical Practice 1, CP1. And what we did is we took the edTPA and we said, let's use that first semester of clinical practice to set our students up with trial runs of edTPA. So when the curriculum for CP1 was, or advanced clinical practice, was developed, we took the edTPA into account. And I hate to use the term teaching to the test, but that's what essentially what we're doing. Okay. And then in 2018-19, our first year of required 2-semester student teaching began, and we began to collect data on our students' performance on the edTPA and on our program as a whole, and we began to pull data sources from a lot of different places. Okay. In 2019 and 20, we had more purposeful assignments. We tweaked our curricula for both Clinical Practice 1 and Clinical Practice 2. We call them Advanced Clinical Practice and Apprenticeship Teaching, respectively. Had we changed the names of the courses when we would have had to go back to the state to look for a program change. So we had the course names set, and that's why we use those. We continue to have additional training for our CP1 instructors and for our field supervisors, because we are looking for continuity, we are looking for reliability, we are looking for validity with what we're doing. And we arranged for our local scorers, to be trained, meaning we took some of our best field supervisors and we sent them to edTPA for training to Pearson on how to become scorers. This year, we've become even more selective and more purposeful, and we're continuing to do this. Okay, so here's what we've been tracking. We've set up, we meaning Kate, who is amazing, has set up a spreadsheet for each of our candidates where we have their core battery scores and how many times they had to take certain sections, their Praxis 2 scores, and how many times they had to take certain sections, the students' GPAs, who is teaching their first semester, their CP1 section, who's teaching the second semester for the seminar that goes with the full-time student teaching. We're looking at their edTPA scores. And informally, we are also looking at which field supervisors are assigned to the various students. That's not really included in our formal data, but it may be in the future. Basically, we're monitoring remote observations, and that's because the last year and a half, all of our field supervisors have moved to remote observations. We found actually that that's pretty helpful because now our students are used to videotaping themselves to send tapes to or videos to their field supervisors to discuss. And we're weeding out some of our field supervisors who aren't able to keep up with the new technology that's required. And that's important for us for many reasons. Okay, Kate, do you want to go over the macro data a bit? Oh, sorry, I missed a slide, sorry. In addition to being proactive with setting up our edTPA and in setting up our 2-semester of student teaching, we also developed a department-wide lesson plan template. And it's the students look at it and they want to rip their hair out. They want to smack us, and we don't blame them for that. But what we did is we included prompts in our lesson plans that asked students to include a central focus, include language function, include language supports, include theoretical principles, and provide and to discuss how they're going to provide feedback to their students. Now, that's not necessarily done at the first course where we teach lesson planning, but as they go through their entire program, through their methods classes, and all of their advanced pedagogy classes, they're used to seeing these prompts. And the advantage of that is that when they get to the edTPA, if they use our lesson plan format, which we require that they use it, then they are ready to take those pieces for the commentaries on the various tasks within edTPA. And that's really important because otherwise our students are writing fairly brief lesson plans, and they aren't thinking about some of the underlying factors which are being required for them to address within the edTPA. So by using I'll call it a full service lesson plan format and using it throughout the program, the students are building up towards the fact that once they get to the edTPA, it will become almost second nature to them. Okay, now I'm going to ask Kate to discuss some of the macro data.
Sure. So right now we just have the first 2 years of data, so the 2018-19 year and then the 2019-20. We had 51 candidates submit in the 2018-19 and 40 candidates submit in the 19-20. So our N is not huge. We're a smaller school than the state programs are, but I still think that we notice some patterns based on this data. And both times we had several students needed to resubmit, some because their portfolios were incomplete in the 2018-19 year. So that when they had to have a complete portfolio, they didn't have to they didn't have to meet the cut score, but they did have to have a complete submission. And then in the 19-20 year, some students resubmitted because they hadn't met the cut score. In the first year, we had 18 out of the 51 who didn't meet the cut score. And we noticed that 6 were in middle school or secondary math. That was almost everybody in the middle or secondary math programs. 9 were elementary. We had 1 P3 and 2 secondary English people who didn't meet the cut score. In 2019-20, we adjusted course a bit, and we had 6 submissions that didn't meet the cut score, but 4 of the 6 were submitted by 2 candidates. So we had a couple of candidates who needed to submit multiple times before they earned a passing score. 2 of those were in secondary math, and 4 of them were elementary. Oops, hang on, I need to get back to the PowerPoint. So with our elementary candidates, we realized that task 4 was the problem, and we attributed that primarily to the fact that when we developed the ACP course, it didn't include a mock assignment in the Clinical Practice 1 course. So whereas they had a trial run the semester prior to doing their edTPA, with the other 3 tasks, there was no trial run for task 4. And so we did make changes to our curriculum to address that. We also made changes to support our secondary math students, particularly in their methodology course, because we got feedback from our instructors in the CP1 course that our math folks were not developing lessons that had an appropriate central focus, and that made it difficult for them to do the sort of analysis that was necessary in order to earn a passing score on the edTPA. Some strengths that we noticed in our 2019-2020 data is that rubrics 6 through 10, the instruction task, our candidates tend to be strongest there. Everybody scored a 3 or 4 for rubric 6, which was the learning environment one. Assessment rubric 12, providing feedback, was also an area of strength where we had the most scores of 4 out of all of the rubrics. And some other observations about successes and performance. In general, we noticed a big shift from the first year to the second year. We don't know whether to attribute that to the fact that candidates knew they had to pass the second year and knew that they just needed to submit the first year, or if it's because of some of the course corrections that we've made. our CP1 professors are being more strict about what's happening in CP1, and the fact that we've adjusted who some of those faculty members are teaching the course. But in general, we've noticed that there is a lot of stress and anxiety related to edTPA. Anecdotally, we've noticed that students who tend to be lax in their submissions in CP1 are the candidates who have more difficulty when they actually have to submit the CP2. So we feel like if candidates are serious when they do it in their trial run, they tend to get more feedback and do a better job when they actually have to submit. We also notice patterns that students with lower GPAs tend to have more difficulty with the edTPA, and that students who had difficulty passing the Praxis 2, their licensure test, will tend to have more difficulty with passing the edTPA. We did not notice a connection between the admission, the core battery, and the edTPA performance. And I'd say that's probably because about half of our students need to take at least one section of the core more than once. So such a large percentage of our students do struggle with the Praxis 1 that it doesn't tend to impact edTPA. And we are looking at contextual factors, particularly COVID-19 related, in connection to successes and performance. Challenges, areas for improvement, rubric 21, which is also in task 4. It's the using evidence to reflect on teaching in connection to math, is the highest frequency of a score of 1. And the rubric indicates that areas of work not aligned with the identified weakness and performance of focus students is one of the reasons to automatically get a 1, or failure to cite specific evidence, or there's a mismatch between what's happening in the math reteach and then what candidates are citing as evidence in their commentary are the reasons for scoring 1. So we still see a need to kind of continue to focus and support our elementary candidates on that task 4. And then rubric 5 in planning has the next highest frequency of 1, which indicates that our candidates are still struggling with differentiation, monitoring and supporting student learning, and then using appropriate supports for students with IEPs and 504s. Some of this may be placed due to confidentiality issues in the placement, or where they're placed, what sort of classroom they're placed in. And then some of it may also be due to remote teaching constraints. Dr. Singer, do you have anything that you wanted to add on that?
Well, some of the issues that we have is that it's really interesting that we are still working to make sure that our candidates understand that just because, and I think everybody has this issue, just because somebody doesn't have a classification does not mean that they don't need differentiation. And we have had some significant issues, obviously, this past year, where cooperating teachers in the schools are trying to get a handle on the remote teaching as it is. Many of our candidates are helping their cooperating teachers with the technology itself. Nonetheless, the issues still have to do with, in a remote environment, how is instruction differentiated? And we've heard a number of different issues, such as it's not. Some schools require cameras on. Some schools say you can't force a student to turn on a camera. And one of the most interesting ones that I heard was that one school was the student teacher was teaching to an in-person class of 5 or 6 students. Students with special needs were Zooming in or on a remote platform, and they had a separate teacher. So those students were forced to watch a lesson, but the student teacher was never permitted to work with them. They had their own specially assigned teacher, which makes issues concerning differentiation for our student teachers exceptionally difficult. So that was an interesting observation. Okay.
Oh, one second. So then I think in terms of next steps for us, revising the syllabus for the college, the CP1 class for elementary, so that there's a formal addition to include a task 4 component is clear that we need to do that. Assuring that our candidates are mastering the glossary for the edTPA handbooks is another next piece. And then thinking about ways to kind of plan backwards in our preparation so that they are better prepared to plan assessments that are supporting diverse learners. Thinking about how do we scaffold that back through our methods courses, which are frequently taught by adjuncts, and also through the undergraduate sequence for our Quest students, which is where they really learn lesson planning. And then,
so one of the issues we have with that third bullet is that this summer, one of our tasks for the summer will be to revise, totally overhaul our official assessment course that everybody's required to take, because we feel that it is totally outdated in terms of what's needed at this point, in terms of devising and analyzing assessments appropriately. So we are totally overhauling that over the summer, all the rubrics, the entire syllabus, in my spare time.
so I guess what we were hoping for in the discussion was to have a little bit of conversation around some of these questions. So curious around what data other folks are tracking in terms of relation to edTPA successes and challenges, patterns that have emerged, or strategies, supports, or interventions that have worked for you at your institution.
And while people are hopefully asking or sharing, one of the things that we noticed is that it's not just students who were lax in CP1 in the trial tasks that had difficulty. One of the other major issues for those students, we found that many of them were students who were lax throughout their program, and they got through their courses and they did what they had to do, but they never went above and beyond the minimum. They were what we would inappropriately call some of our lazier candidates. They didn't necessarily follow instructions, not the first time, not the second time. This is why they run into problems. And you know, we tell them when you're doing your edTPA, particularly the commentaries, this is not a time to be concise and keep it down to 1 or 2 sentences. This is the time to let it all hang out and to shine and promote as much as you can. And yet I found that, because I've read a lot of their submissions, is that some of these students are minimalists, and minimal doesn't make it. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Miriam and Kate. That was an excellent presentation. So the question for the participants is, how have you dealt with these issues with edTPA? If I understood it correctly, you said that one of the rubrics, well, for the elementary ed, is the math portion, which is a separate rubric that other portfolios don't have. And in general, the idea of differentiation seems to be an issue for your candidates. I'm wondering if others have found the same, if they have had the same kind of difficulty with their candidates in the edTPA, and what strategies have people used as they look at the data to increase those scores, not in general scores, but in particular in those rubrics or indicators. Anybody want to contribute? Please feel free to turn on your camera, contribute to this discussion, or if you have any questions.
We're happy to do open mic. We're kind of used to that by now.
Hi.
Hi, Sharon. Hi, Eileen.
So I would like to Hi, Eileen. I'd like to contribute. So we presented actually at 10 o'clock this morning our innovation, where we taught our students to understand what critical thinking means, and we gave them practice in writing using critical thinking aside from edTPA. So we actually include a strand, not in all the courses, this was basically our experiment, but we include a strand where they read a rubric, not necessarily an edTPA rubric, they write to the rubric and they analyze. So we're practicing the skills that they need to use with edTPA, and then we introduce them to the edTPA rubrics. Because we found that their ability to write is hindered by their ability to understand what it means to analyze, interpret, evaluate. So if you at a later date, if you want to take a look at our presentation, it's going to be uploaded to the NJACTE website. It shows what we actually do to help them learn to write better.
Thank you so much, Sharon. In some of the studies that I've looked at, it seems there is a correlation between English language skills and the edTPA. So if you're a good writer, you tend to do better. But what you're saying is before you write, you need to think and analyze that rubric. So
yeah,
so we actually do have we start some critical thinking activities actually with their first or second courses in pedagogy. And we have them, one of the tasks that we have them do is to select a particular theory or theorist and read two selections, either by the same person or two selections on the same topic, and then to do a compare and contrast. And for every single, this is department-wide, we present our students with the rubrics right up front so they know and we go over that when we give an assignment so they know exactly what they're reading and writing to, what we're looking for. And every one of our rubrics also has a mechanics component, so that spelling, punctuation, grammar, all that counts. And we think that that's really important for our students. Yes, you're correct. Some of our students can't write a proper grocery list.
And one of the things that we've been doing is giving our students feedback on rubrics other than edTPA rubrics, and then allowing them to resubmit. Because basically when they're doing edTPA, we can't look at what they've written. So our only opportunity to assist is before, right? Our only opportunity is a non-edTPA exercise. And it's really interesting to see that when we give this feedback, they're able to do a way better job, because they don't, and it's interesting because I happen to be giving this assignment for tomorrow, right, in my class. And I just had a student write to me this morning and said, I'm not sure about how much I should write. And I said, that's fine. Do what you think you should do, reading my prompt. I'll give you feedback, and then I'm going to allow you to resubmit it to me, because I'm never going to be able to do this again, right? It's illegal. So here's your chance for getting it wrong and getting your feedback.
Thank you, Sharon. We have a comment or perhaps a question on the chat, and it's from Montclair. And she says, Samantha says, we notice a dip at Montclair for rubric 2, which is varied student learning needs, for last semester, during which most of our students were in virtual environments where there was typically one of our strongest rubrics. So before the pandemic, it was the strongest rubric, and now there was a dip. Still trying to figure out how to address it. Any comments on that? Any help from Montclair?
Well, this is a problem, and Kate lives in Montclair, so maybe I'm going to let her take this one first.
She's saying at Montclair State, right?
Right, but she lives there, so she knows where,
right.
the turf.
I mean, I do think that just thinking about the virtual environments and how to support students has been challenging for licensed teachers. And so for candidates, I think it is also a challenge, and considering ways to be able to use breakout rooms or other supports that are built into the virtual platform is challenging. And so I think for them thinking about either the different resources that they can provide or different configurations of grouping. I know for my own kids that has been helpful because I have a 3rd and a 4th grader. So that sort of thing has been helpful in connection to providing that individualized support. But I think even just being able to explain, I think sometimes our candidates do things, but they are unable to explain what it is that they've done. And so as a scorer, I was trained as an edTPA scorer when this was coming down because I wanted to see what the backside of it was on the scoring end. And I found that lots of times what was in the documents was sufficient, but the commentary didn't point to that evidence more concretely enough. So I think sometimes the problem is what was mentioned before. It's like the writing or the explanation, the analysis of what's already there is where our candidates struggle, and being able to point accurately to what they've already included. So
I did a study maybe 10 years ago with one of my colleagues who is in special education, and we looked at what students were reporting that they were seeing and then how they responded to certain prompts. And their narratives in their journals showed that they were seeing all the right things. But in the prompts, they were unable to link what they saw with what it represented. We see the same thing within the edTPA, that many times, I'll have somebody who said, well, I'm teaching an AP class. Where am I going to find a candidate, a focus student who has a special needs? And I said, is everybody in your AP class on exactly the same level? And they don't get that. They're missing that component. They're also missing a component that a gifted child has a special need.
An English
And
learner,
they may,
an English
gifted
learner could be in the class.
right. And because let's say if it's in an AP math class, math being a somewhat more universal language, a student who has an English language need, okay, may have difficulty with the word problems, but what they're testing or what they're assessing for edTPA are computational issues. So they don't see certain things and they can't make those connections. So I think you're 100% right. I think we have to actually be explicit in our teaching that let's look at this connection. What are you seeing and what does it really represent? And I lead my own students through this when we look at data and we analyze data, which was very much spot on this morning with with Linda Susky, that I found that a lot of what she was saying was absolutely matching what we're finding in being explicit in explaining this to our students. You're looking at data. What does it mean?
Great. Eileen, I know you have your camera on. Did you have a question or a comment?
No, can you hear me? I'm having trouble with my microphone. So, one thing I wanted to say about the math is you raised a good question that I want to investigate, because we have our elementary students complete that task 4 in their clinical 1. But the special ed students who also take elementary, they do it in clinical 2. And I'm wondering if their scores are any different, because maybe they're not as rushed and as stressed, and maybe you'll feel a little more supported. So I'm going to look into that and see. It'll be interesting to see. I also
Okay.
wondered what percentage of your students were submitting this semester, and how many were taking.
All of our students are submitting this semester. We have, what do we have, 40 some students submitting this semester? So every one of them will submit or has submitted already. So they've all submitted, and they will all be required to submit. And we have been told very specifically by the state that we cannot prevent our students from graduating or getting a grade based on their edTPA, but that will, of course, if they don't pass, hold up their certification issues. And we will not recommend anybody for certification. Now, I have one young man in my alternate route right now who is teaching remotely. He cannot get a platform that will video his students, and he's teaching ESL. So he will be graded locally, but he will have a score, and we will submit him, or he will submit his VOPC eventually. Sharon put in a really interesting comment into the chat, and that relates right on back to that context for learning. I cannot tell you the number of assignments that we have in our clinical, not practice, clinical experiences, where we ask students to identify the contextual factors of their placement and why it's relevant to what they're doing. And we discuss that over and over again. Why do you need to know the community? Why do you need to know the culture of the community? And it's picked up in the edTPA rubrics very specifically. So I think starting that really early, where we have students investigate the various communities and to do a compare and contrast of communities around the state, has been very valuable. 14 out of 240 is not bad.
And Sharon also points out that it's very important for teacher candidates to identify their own cultural background, their own biases, if you will, so that by knowing yourself, you can look at the wider community of the school. So that's an excellent point.
I think,
Sharon?
yeah, we're not, because most of our candidates follow a fall spring cycle and they submit in the spring, we don't have significant data for what has happened this whole year. And many of our candidates had already submitted last spring prior to us shutting down, because we always advise them to try to submit by mid-March. So most of them had already done the videoing, or so they weren't so impacted last spring. So it will be interesting to see, Samantha, I think, what our data looks like this year on a broader scale. We have a few off sequence who do a spring fall placement, but most of our candidates will be fall spring. And so we're just starting to get those scores back now.
Yeah, right now we had, I think, 5 people off sequence who finished, excuse me, in December, and we've got 6 or 7, I don't remember, on off sequence who will finish next December. I want to just mention one particular book to people, which I'm sure you can find used on thrift books or something like that. There's a book that's called Black Ants and Buddhists, and the author is Mary Cowie. And it does really relate, the book itself, a little bit more towards early childhood. But if you get this book and you read the introduction, which is fabulous, it will give you, and I share it with students, or I used to when I taught intro classes, it gives them a whole new perspective on why understanding your constituents' cultural capital is so important.
Great. Kate, if you can put, or Miriam, if you can put the name of the book and the author.
Sure, I'll be happy to.
It would be great. Well, we have 2 minutes, and I definitely want to thank the presenters. This was a very interesting discussion. We have a couple of things in the chat. From Sharon, the Harvard implicit bias test is an excellent way for teacher candidates to learn about themselves. Our rubrics have significantly changed with virtual, rubric 2, 7, and 8 in particular for Montclair. Black ants and Buddhist, thinking critically and teaching differently in the primary grades.
That's amusing that Kate has the same book.
Is the book from Kate?
No, I had the book when it first came out.
And Miriam has it too, and the author is Mary Cowhey. Mm-hmm. And Eileen agrees. It's a great book and shows that you can engage young children in their community. And we thank you all for an excellent presentation. And I'm intrigued about tracking those relationships like lower GPA, praxis, core battery, and the correlation with edTPA. I think that is greatly needed because we may be testing something we don't want to test. We don't know what edTPA really assesses. Maybe assessing something totally different than performance in the classroom. But the only way to know that is to track those.
I do want to mention one thing. I didn't want to interrupt Anna Marie, but one of the things that we did look at was the seminar professors for CP1, and we actually got rid of a couple of them because they were not preparing our students and supporting our students appropriately, and we're not letting them teach that course again.
Yeah, that's a very good move. If you can document it and you can say, this makes a difference, that's the way to do it.
Yep. So it's helped us in a lot of ways so far. We're still working on it. It's always a work in progress.
But you're doing great work. We appreciate your work and we appreciate the presentation.
And I appreciate the questions and the feedback. Thank you from others, because I think that knowing that others have had similar experiences, I think has made a big difference for us too.